At precisely 0100 hours Tehran time, Iran's entire Western air defense shield, the formidable Kamali Network, went offline. Not a glitch, not a rolling brownout, a complete, instantaneous, and terrifying digital blackout. The world's intelligence agencies are now asking one terrifying question. Was this the opening shot of a war, a catastrophic internal failure, or something far more sophisticated? The silence was the first sign. In the underground command bunker of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force, dozens of screens went black simultaneously. No warning, no cascading system failures. One moment, they were tracking every commercial flight, every coalition drone, every satellite pass, from the Turkish border to the Persian Gulf. The next, there was nothing, a void. The digital eyes and ears of the Islamic Republic were blind and deaf. This was not a simple radar outage. The Kamali Integrated Air Defense System, a multi-billion-dollar project amalgamating Russian S-300 launchers with domestically produced Bavar 373 radar arrays and a new generation of drone-linked targeting computers, represented the pinnacle of Iran's defensive strategy. It was designed with triple redundancy. It was hardened against electronic warfare. It was, according to Tehran's own propaganda, impenetrable. And now, it was gone. Thousands of miles away, at Fort Meade, Maryland, the watch floor of U.S. Cyber Command lit up. Alarms, silent and digital, screamed across secure networks. Analysts stared, disbelieving, at their own maps of Iranian military infrastructure. The data streams they monitored 24 hours a day, the electronic ghosts they hunted in the Persian ether, had simply vanished. An entire ecosystem of signals had ceased to exist. The initial assumption was clear. This was one of their own. A clandestine U.S. cyber weapon, a long-dormant logic bomb, had finally been activated. But frantic checks of every active operation, from STUXNET's descendants to newer, more secret programs, came back negative. No U.S. asset was responsible. The Pentagon was just as blind as the IRGC. In Tel Aviv, the reaction was identical. Mossad and Unit 8200, Israel's elite signals intelligence agency, were in a state of high alert. They had war-gamed decapitating the Kamali network for years. They had the tools. They had the capability. But this wasn't their signature. It was too sudden, too total. There was no electronic chatter, no reconnaissance probes, no preparatory cyber reconnaissance. It was as if someone had found a master switch deep inside Iran's most secure military network and simply turned it off. Rehook. But then, at 0137, something impossible happened. A single radar station, a remote early warning outpost in the Zagros Mountains, flickered back to life. But it wasn't broadcasting military signals. It was transmitting a repeating, unencrypted snippet of a civilian radio broadcast from 1978, a year before the Islamic Revolution. This changed everything. This wasn't just a shutdown, it was a hijacking. A digital ghost had not only broken into the system and killed it, but was now playing games with the corpse. For the analysts at Fort Meade, the chilling realization dawned. If the attacker could make a dead system broadcast old music, they could just as easily make it broadcast false targets. They could paint a phantom fleet of American B-2 bombers on the screens of the few remaining independent radars, forcing the IRGC to make a fatal choice. The blackout was no longer just a defensive problem for Iran. It was a strategic nightmare for the entire world. Inside Iran, chaos was turning to paranoia. The IRGC, cut off from their primary command and control network, reverted to Cold War-era protocols. Desperate commanders were using runners and civilian telephone lines to try and get status reports from their billion-dollar surface-to-air missile batteries. They were operating under the assumption that a full-scale U.S. or Israeli first strike was imminent. The lack of radar data was not seen as a technical fault, but as the direct result of overwhelming enemy jamming, the prelude to a storm of cruise missiles. They were wrong. From their orbits high above, American and Israeli reconnaissance satellites showed a placid picture. No bombers were taking off. No naval fleets were repositioning for an attack. The skies over Iraq and the Persian Gulf were quiet. The aggressor, whoever it was making no overt military move. This was an attack made of pure information, a weaponized blackout. The question now became, who has this power? The list was short. The United States, Israel, Russia, and China were the only state actors believed to possess the godlike cyber capabilities to pull off an attack of this magnitude and sophistication. But it served none of their immediate strategic interests to do so without a follow-up. To blind your enemy and then do nothing is not a strategy, it's a message. And no one was claiming responsibility. Rehook. Just as a working theory of a Russian or Chinese probe began to gain traction in Western intelligence circles, a new piece of intelligence landed. A U.S. Navy SIGINT satellite, the Orion 9, on a routine passive listening pass, recorded a series of 5 tightly packed, ultra-high-frequency data bursts. They occurred just 90 seconds before the Kamali Network went down, and they didn't originate from outside the country. The source was terrestrial, emanating from a desolate, unpopulated stretch of the Dashti Kavir Desert, 200 kilometers southeast of Tehran. This was the smoking gun. This wasn't an external hack that breached a firewall. This was an inside job. Someone on the ground, deep inside Iran, had used a powerful, short-range transmitter to inject the kill signal directly into a fiber-optic network node or a microwave relay station. This required on-the-ground intelligence, precise timing, and technology that was both compact and immensely powerful. The profile no longer fit a foreign state actor's remote attack. This was the work of a ghost cell, an elite special operations team, or a highly placed internal traitor. The NSA's top cryptographers were immediately tasked with breaking the transmission. While the signal itself was likely just a carrier for the malicious code, any residual data, any fragment of its architecture, could provide a clue to its origin. For hours, supercomputers at the Utah data center worked, cross-referencing the signal's modulation and frequency hopping pattern against every known signals profile in their database. They found nothing. The technology was new. It was unknown. Then, a junior analyst tried a different approach. Instead of treating the carrier wave's fluctuations as part of a complex encryption, she treated them as a form of digital steganography, a message hidden within the structure of the message itself. She ran it through a developmental quantum decryption algorithm, and she got a hit. It wasn't the attack code. It wasn't a message from the saboteurs. It was a payload of stolen data being exfiltrated in the same burst that carried the shutdown command. The attacker hadn't just turned the system off. They had robbed the house on their way out. The data package was enormous, containing terabytes of raw information. But as the first fragments were pieced together, a terrifying new picture began to emerge. The file wasn't a list of Iranian nuclear scientists or missile schematics. It was a live, moment-by-moment diagnostic log from the Kamali Network itself, and it contained a detailed schematic, but not for a weapon. It was a map of Tehran's civilian power grid, highlighting 3 critical substation nodes. They weren't just blinding the military. They were mapping the city for a blackout. Rehook. But why? Why would an attacker with the power to decapitate the entire Iranian military also need to plunge a city of 9 million civilians into darkness? If their goal was a conventional military strike, they had already won. The IRGC was deaf, dumb, and blind. A citywide blackout was redundant. It was overkill. Unless the city itself wasn't the target. Unless the darkness was just a curtain designed to hide the real show. Back at Fort Meade, the junior analyst who had decrypted the data package couldn't shake a sense of unease. The 3 targeted substations, Firouzeh, Mirdamad, and Vanak, were indeed critical, but something about their specific placement felt wrong. On a hunch, she pulled up a different kind of map, a public works schematic of Tehran's underground infrastructure, layering it over the power grid data. The 3 substations didn't just form a triangle of control over the city's power. They formed a perfect energy corridor. Their underground trunk lines all converged on a single, non-military, non-governmental city block. A block that housed the National Museum of Iran. This was the moment the entire nature of the attack pivoted. It wasn't an act of war. It was a heist. The most sophisticated, high-stakes, nation-crippling heist in human history. The attacker hadn't just disabled the security cameras. They had disabled the entire country to cover their tracks. Suddenly, the other piece of the puzzle, the taunting 1978 pop music, snapped into focus. 1978, the final year of the Shah, a year before the Islamic Revolution changed everything. The music wasn't a random taunt. It was a signature, a calling card. Western intelligence had long dismissed rumors of a diaspora group of ultra-nationalist monarchists, the children and grandchildren of the Shah's exiled Savak intelligence officers and military elite. They were called Javedan, the Immortals, after the Shah's own royal guard. They were thought to be a fantasy, a collection of old men in Parisian cafes dreaming of a lost world. But what if they weren't? What if, for 40 years, they had patiently cultivated their resources, funneled their family fortunes into bleeding-edge technology, and trained a new generation not for a war, but for a single, impossible operation? What could possibly be inside that museum that was worth gambling with World War III? It wasn't the crown jewels, They were accounted for. It wasn't a lost work of art. The Javedan weren't thieves. They were zealots. The exfiltrated data log from the Kamali Network, when further analyzed, gave a clue. It showed intermittent, highly encrypted sensor readings coming from a deep sub-basement of the museum, a section that didn't appear on any official blueprints. The signals were faint, but their pattern matched the energy signature of one very specific thing: a dormant nuclear non-proliferation sensor, placed there by the IAEA in the early 1970s to monitor the Shah's own atomic ambitions. But the sensor wasn't dormant, and according to the stolen logs, it wasn't detecting trace isotopes. It was monitoring a powerful, self-contained energy source, something ancient, unearthed during the construction of the Tehran metro in the 70s, and hidden by the Shah's regime before the revolution could expose it. Something that the new regime had spent decades trying, and failing, to understand. While the world's superpowers were staring at their military maps, trying to figure out who was attacking whom, a ghost team of high-tech zealots was using a national blackout as a smokescreen to steal a piece of forgotten, and perhaps alien, technology from a museum basement. Inside Tehran, the first reports started to trickle into the IRGC's emergency command post, not of missile strikes, but of strange power surges directed towards the 3 offline substations. Field engineers reported that the nodes were drawing massive amounts of power from the rest of the grid, as if trying to energize something. The commanders, terrified and confused, dispatched a Quds Force rapid response team to the centralmost point of the anomaly. Their destination: the National Museum. They had no idea what they were looking for. They just knew the enemy was there. The armored vehicles screeched to a halt outside the silent museum. Within seconds, a dozen Quds Force commandos stormed the grand entrance, their green-tinged night vision cutting through the cavernous, blacked-out halls. They moved with lethal efficiency, sweeping past priceless artifacts, their only guide the faint, rhythmic hum of stolen energy emanating from the earth below. They were soldiers, hunting for an enemy they couldn't comprehend, in a battle that had been decided before they even knew it had begun. Deep in the sub-basement, the Javedan team worked in disciplined silence. The object at the center of the room was no longer inert. It was a complex, crystalline lattice, now glowing with a brilliant blue light, thrumming with the combined power of 3 city substations. Thick, hastily run cables snaked from the artifact, feeding it the very lifeblood of Tehran. This wasn't just a power source, it was a tuning fork, being struck with the force of a metropolis. The rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed from the stairwell above. The Javedan leader, watching the approach on a holographic wrist display, showed no signs of panic. She looked at the chief technician, who gave a single, sharp nod. The plan had allowed for this. They weren't there to fight a battle. They were there to catch a train that had been waiting for 40 years. With a tap on her display, she diverted the entire power flow into the object's core. A thermobaric charge blew the sub-basement's reinforced steel door off its hinges. The Quds Force commandos poured in, weapons hot, ready to unleash hell. They found nothing. The room was empty. The heavy power cables lay on the floor, their ends fused into molten copper. The air smelled of ozone and scorched concrete. Where the impossible object and its thieves had stood just seconds before, there was only a shimmering distortion in the air, which quickly faded to nothing. All at once, across the sprawling city of Tehran, the lights flickered back to life. The Kamali Network began a stuttering, chaotic reboot. To the world, Iran had just survived the most sophisticated cyber attack in history. At Fort Meade, the junior analyst watched the energy signature over Tehran vanish from her screen. It didn't power down. It simply ceased to be. For a single, unexplainable microsecond, her global sensor net registered a ghost signal, a localized space-time displacement, over a desolate, uninhabited peak in the Andes Mountains, before it too was gone. The official story would be one of faceless hackers and national resilience. A near miss in a new era of digital warfare. But the truth was infinitely stranger. No one would ever know that a ghost dynasty, armed with bleeding-edge science and a 40-year-old grudge, had used the threat of World War III as a simple diversion. They hadn't come to reclaim a throne. They had come to reclaim a key. The ancient device hummed in recognition of her touch, its internal light shifting from blue to a brilliant, star-like gold. She looked out through the dome's transparent walls at the sea of stars above, a faint, triumphant smile on her face. The Shah's secret was safe. The work could now begin. The old world of nations and borders had just been rendered obsolete. They just didn't know it yet. The front lines of history are not always drawn in sand and soil. Sometimes they are hidden in the code, buried under museums, and fought for by ghosts. To understand the wars of tomorrow, you have to break the news of today. Subscribe to Breaking_the_Front.